One of my favorite aspects of reading Finnegans Wake is the way it explicitly thematizes the writing process in all of its ambiguities and contingencies. And in studying James Joyce's manuscripts, particularly the Buffalo manuscripts, which can be found at the University of Buffalo, one can get a look into the creative universe of James Joyce and understand the development of his creative process. Understand his style, technique, methods, words, and phrases as developing through time and subject to confusion, ambiguity, backtracking, and all sorts of interesting developments. In this short 2-lecture series, I would like to look at Buffalo Notebooks 37 and 38, showing you the pages and giving you some preliminary glosses to show the relevance of studying manuscripts to understanding Finnegans Wake. We can understand how Joyce's style manifests on the level of very short, compact words that Joyce no doubt thought a lot about before he put them on the page. And he would take these notebooks everywhere with him, on vacation, while he was on walks, while he's going to get food. So oftentimes his handwriting style can change dramatically, and this can actually help us track. For example, did he pause in between a sentence and come back to it later? Hence, his handwriting style will probably change. Is he using a different writing utensil? It tells us things about the location that he was at in terms of whether or not he would have been able to obtain this particular writing utensil or not. But all that aside, I would like to just give you some ideas for thinking about the importance of genetic criticism in studying Finnegans Wake. Genetic criticism being a theoretical framework that tracks the development of the text as a contingent artifact. Rather than trying to produce some sort of text or some sort of critical edition, we chart the developmental process of different manuscripts, notes, letters, and in so doing, we get a sense of the author not as the master of the text, but as a textual remnant that we see evolving through time. And through the author's interaction by retrospectively looking back on his old notes, we get a critical dialectic that allows for the development of the author alongside his text, and hence the highly autobiographical nature of Finnegans Wake. A lot of the characters, especially Shem the penman, are in fact autobiographical representations of Joyce, and in some sense, all of the characters represent certain compulsions of his, certain obsessions, certain places of guilt or uncomfortability. And by examining the development of these manuscripts, it's as if we are seeing a bit of his soul peek through the cracks of this fragmentary textual process. On page 22, it says father of his ba, and I think this is referring to the ba sound that a sheep makes. Hence, the ba would be Izzy, the daughter of the father, and this creates an infantilizing relationship that we see between HCE and Izzy throughout, and between Sean and Izzy throughout, as various flirtations between male family members and female family members occur. And we're always trying to gain a sense of culpability. Is this due to a power imbalance, and hence we have some sort of complex that's developing here, in which the daughter becomes dependent upon the father in a familial way and then in a sexual way? Or is the daughter coming on to the father, because we certainly get little hints at that at various points in the text? Below that it says proportional persons, this no doubt referring to Shem and Sean, who are two parts of a binary, and there are many different binaries that they represent. They represent Shem as the ear and Sean as the eyes, hence the difference between the auditory and the visual. They represent the spiritual and the rational. They represent art and freedom versus law and restriction and institutions. And they're always fighting it out, like Egyptian gods like Seth and Horus. And in so doing, we get a development in which the brothers actually sublate themselves as a sort of dialectic, with Sean seeming to come out on top. But Shem always leaks through. Hence the obsession with proportional binaries that Joyce gets from Giordano Bruno, that every act of creation is an act of destruction and vice versa. Every high corresponds to a low, and these happen in sequence, and you can't have one thing without its opposite. And Joyce tries to coordinate this into a textual system, which seems here to be governed by elegant control, and he has that marked out. And anytime he has these marked out, it's generally accepted that this means that he has incorporated it into Finnegans Wake in some manner. Maybe he's changed it in the process of selecting it and then putting it into the wake, but nevertheless he uses this so that when he refers back to it, he doesn't end up copying a note more than once. But this notion of elegant control is very much a sort of modernist trope, right? The artist has some control over what's going on, and we're always questioning whether or not Joyce is really in control of the text or whether the text sort of extends beyond what Joyce had in mind. I'm definitely privy to the latter. But nevertheless, we can see with the careful crafting of portmanteau words and characters and plot structures and styles over time that Joyce was certainly keen on seeing this text as highly controlled, as a sort of hyper-packed textual economy in which every inch of the page is used to the maximum extent. Joyce writes, "Words and a prayer for you," which hints at one of the key linguistic obsessions in Finnegans Wake, which is the blending of the prayer with speech. That these are, in a sense, two sides of the same coin, that the incantatory power of prayer, the obsession with repetition that we see in prayer, with the establishment of history, which gives a sense of continuity to the prayer, gives a sense of historical depth, that is bound up with the way that we use words, and that words are, in a sense, a form of prayer. They ask of certain things, we speak into the void, and we hope that someone will enter into this communicatory act with us. Here on page 50, he speaks of Nogtime, which would seem to imply nighttime, which is, of course, the time at which Finnegans Wake takes place. And Joyce wants to view nighttime as a sort of nicht time, of nothing time or no time, that the idea of time's linearity sort of breaks down here because we have all sorts of crisscrossing narrative and character and stylistic paths which weave over each other in a dense fabric such that we can't really tell the warp from the weave, so to speak. Very enigmatically, he writes, "Philo need death, weaker ear." And I find this a very interesting phrase. I don't really know what it means, but it seems to imply to me that death has a pull, that it creates a need, a gap to be filled. And the ear, even when it is weak and unresponsive in sleep, is always trying to fill this need of what it's like to be dead. Because Joyce seems to hint throughout Finnegans Wake that being asleep is probably as close as we get to death, except for dying. That we have the possibility, of course, of going to sleep and not waking up. And we don't really worry about this except when we get maybe the occasional nightmare. And we wake up pleased that we just were able to wake up. So I think this deep need can only be filled by the ear and the weak ear from sleep. which is not exactly as responsive as the waking era. There's a sort of time lag. And in the lag that comes from not being awake, we have the very possibility for the low from which we can awake. In the midst of this low, Joyce describes it as a dream of gnashing, which seems to me to be a reference to there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth from the Bible. Hence, we have a sort of nightmare that's going on here. And yet, in response, immediately below that, we have the expression up there, which seems to dare us to wake up, which hints at one of the possible meanings of the title of Finnegans Wake, which is that it is a command. Finnegans, wake. It is telling you not only informatively that Finnegans do in fact wake, but that one ought to wake. That from this dream of gnashing, which this also might be a reference to like chocolate ganache, and hence the obsession with food that we get in Finnegans Wake, asking us to get up from this food coma, from this stumbling over, from the mysterious crime that seems to have occurred in Finnegans Wake. I quite like some of the wordplay that he's doing here on page 67, using the word ajib, which seems to have a sort of Arabic tinge to it, right? It sounds like jim or like, alif lam mim, kind of, it has that sort of sound to it. But it almost seems like ajib here is like a unit of letter. It's not necessarily a phoneme, but ajib is like a dot or a tittle on a page, so to speak. Also, he speaks of tilt here, which seems to imply something to do with the way that we tilt the page as we're trying to understand what's going on. We're moving it around and we're actually experimenting with the text physically and materially. Hence, we grapple with the text, which is a quite interesting word because this is a mix with groveling with the text, like getting on our knees and groveling, and also grappling with it. Hence, we're always kind of on the verge of finding something, and that something may in fact be poop, as he puts it here. And all of this is mixed together in a femixer. This may be like a cement mixer, but all of which is taking place at the Phoenix Park, which of course is a very significant location in terms of Irish history, in terms of its location in Dublin, but also because of the mythological significance of the phoenix, which rises from the ashes, which in Finnegans Wake takes on a more dirty tinge, like the color of the River Liffey, and is in fact excrement or poop. And I think Finnegans Wake is a lesson in delayed gratification. Hence, Joyce says, supply after, which seems to me to be a mix between supply after and shop after. As in, you will be supplied what you need by the market, by, these shopping centers, after you wake. That, in fact, you need to wait for the gift of grace. That, this is a delayed gift. This is, in a sense, deferred constantly. It's a promise one is given by God in Christianity, but it's always deferred until after the deluge. Hence, he writes, after deluge. He also says, a flood on Oweth. Oweth seeming to be very similar to Howth, which is where we start Finnegans Wake. And this is a flood, but it's also a load. It's an offload. We are unloading our unconscious anxieties, fears, preoccupations, phantasms, and it becomes a sort of unconscious deluge of the id. Very similar to how Deleuze and Guattari start off anti-Oedipus, that it eats, it shits, and it fucks. It starts and stops. What a mistake to have ever said the id. Everywhere it is machines. Not figurative ones, real ones, etc., right? So this seems to me to be really emblematic of what Finnegans Wake is, that it is a verbal deluge, the outcome of which and the payback will only come after. And in a sense, we're not promised that the bill will get repaid, that the effort will be worth it. I still don't quite know what to make of this one, but it seems interesting. No more burial of gold. To me, this seems to be a reference to the Bible story in which the son is burying his inheritance in the ground, right? So maybe this might be something about there's no point in these frivolous concepts of hoarding, that we need to be more frugal, perhaps, because Joyce was famously always teetering on the edge financially. But much more interestingly on this page, he's experimenting with orthography, talking about runic and spelling it two different ways here, R-U-N-I-K or R-E-N-I-K. He also speaks of cuneans, as in cuneiform. So he's experimenting with the runes of the Norse and cuneiform of the Egyptians, or of various other kind of Semitic or Mesopotamian cultures where cuneiform is used. And I think this shows an obsession that Joyce had with writing and reading and acting all as material. That these all take place, for Joyce, of course, on the page, but by extension, everything that's happening when we talk about characters doing things, we have to talk about words doing things, and in particular, we have to talk about orthography doing things. We have to pay attention to the way that these runes, these renanigans, as he puts it, right? These shenanigans of runes, how they are played out on the page, and really see it as a game of play, right? With all the arbitrariness that goes along with that word. When we play games, there's no a priori reason that the rules should be as such. They only make sense because we've created a system which seems coherent to us, because of course there are no a priori criterion for coherence either. Coherence requires subjective appraisal of what is considered and deemed coherent as such. Therefore, runes and these renanigans are in fact rather arbitrary. And I think Joyce is telling us that we just need to be okay with that. Hence, him spelling runic two different ways on the page, showing us that spelling conventions are constantly being shirked by him. And Finnegans Wake sees a lot of continuity between Ulysses and Finnegans Wake, because Joyce starts writing it in 1923, and he, of course, doesn't publish it until 1939, so he's involved in the 16-year-long process of drafting various versions and thinking of various words. Hence, he's always obsessed with the immigrant, with the outcast, with the expat, the one who is other in his own home and is forced to make a new home. Hence, he ends A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man with Stephen Dedalus going to forge in the smithy of his soul the uncreated conscience of his race. This idea of racial identity is in fact rather vacuous, and identity itself is a constant process of immigration. And therefore we have another sort of command, or simply a description, seamen wake, which could have multiple meanings. This could be a visual saying, as in see men wake, as in S-E-E, commanding us to watch the waking occur throughout Finnegans Wake, this very convoluted process by which HCE seems to regain his strength through the surrogacy of his son Sean, who acts as his redemptive potential as HCE goes through various spells of impotence. But this also could be semen, as in ejaculate, right? That children wake. This would also follow with Sean, the child, waking and, in a sense, revitalizing the law of the father, but on his own terms, just as the immigrant does with his own culture and with the culture that he interacts with. He is met with laws and he realizes their arbitrary nature and is forced to come to some sort of symbolic reconciliation with both the symbolic and with the real, and hence reorient the elements as he would like, which is what Joyce is doing here orthographically, linguistically, stylistically, etc. Once again, I don't know what to make of this, but it seems important. Boardcloth birth on us, here in parentheses. This seems to me to have a sort of ethical exhortation about it. that we have a cloth stretched over a board, which is seeming to refer to how early pages of text would be made, as animal skin would be stretched over a flat surface of some kind and it would be flattened, and in so doing it would allow for the birth of language. And I think Joyce is saying that every time we read, we are stretching this cloth over the board. This also could be like the boards, as in the end covers of the books, right? The boards is the hard cover on each side of a book. So this board cloth-covered book allows for the birth of, well, the subject of what is being birthed is unspecified. But who is to do that birthing is us, that the onus is on us. And considered as both a promise and a warning, near is both can be seen as referring to Shem and Shan, these two dueling principles, which means that we are always risking creative overload as well as a reduction into tradition and forms. So on the one hand, we have under-schematization, on the other hand, over-schematization. On the one hand, too much creativity, and hence pure liberation, which leads to death, and on the other hand, complete refinement, which leads to slavery. So both of these potentials are always near us, and I think this is a hermeneutic question, too, of how do we respond to the nearness of both of these poles. And I think this is a markedly postmodern phrase, as flat as you. The text is as flat as we. Because a postmodern point is that history has collapsed in the face of discourse and power, and simulation and simulacra, image and spectacle and phantasmagoria, and that the text is in fact flat. And depth is merely something which is betrayed to us, but which in fact is not an ontological reality. It is an effect or a function of a signification field, right? That a series of signifiers come together on the page and they come into confluence in such a way that they give the illusion of depth. And in fact, this may be what Joyce is trying to say about self-identity, that we too are flat, and the way we gain our sense of depth is through our projection into the world, very similar to how Lacan talks about the mirror stage, that the mirror stage is the entrance of the subject into the social and into history, and through that we get both the assurance of alienation and the possibility of recognition. So that's what's going on with the text, right? We offer ourselves to the text and we allow the text to profoundly meet us, and conversely, for Joyce to be met by us as we see him through the text. And of course, it's a flattened version. It is flattened out onto the page like we were talking about earlier, as we flatten out that cloth and we try to do something with it. But I don't think Joyce is denying depth here. He's just saying that we need to realize that the text affects us. It affects us in an affective way. It gives us things which immediately penetrate us as events, and that when we read the text, we are engaged with this flat surface qua event. Joyce's wordplay starts to pick up a bit here. Fig his pig horn, post and poldy. Now, poldy was a nickname for Leopold Bloom in Ulysses, which Molly used to refer to him. And he kind of liked it, he kind of didn't. It throughout Ulysses got associated with some sort of nasty memories because Blazes Boylan, who is basically cucking Bloom, is always in the back of his mind when Molly calls him Poldy, because he kind of sees it as demeaning in a way, but also kind of sweet, right? Because it's his own nickname. And the post here may very well likely be referring to Sean the postman, the one of two sons of HCE. And the pig horn, this could have a sexual connotation. This could be a penis. And seen in its sort of base function here, hence the reference of the pig. And I'm not really sure the function of figging his pig. Of course, fig here, it's an action, right? Figging is something that is done to his pig horn. It could mean a lot of things. It brings to mind for me the fig tree imagery and symbolism in the Bible, but I really don't know what to make of it in terms of a coherent gloss. But as in Ulysses, our main male character is suffering from some sort of sexual impotence, which in Finnegans Wake is tied up with feelings of guilt regarding a alleged, at the very least, crime, something he may have committed, something, in fact, he may be innocent of in some regards. It's a very complicated game, but I think when Joyce refers to his dull emitter, and he has it crossed out, I think this is a reference to the impotent penis, right? It emits ejaculate, but it's dull, hence it is flaccid, it is potentially dysfunctional in some way, which may be a sort of physical embodiment of some psychic stress upon him, which is kind of an anatomical fact about, erectile dysfunction tends to accompany anxiety and mental struggles of various kinds that don't allow one to emit that libidinal energy in the way that it needs to. And Finnegans Wake is all about a push and pull of language, of history, of identity, of customs and norms. And these two, of course, are the dueling halves of the binary that is Shem and Sean. And very key here, Joyce says simply Sunday. What's so important about Sunday? Well, of course, Sunday is the day of the sun in which the sun rises. And in the essay, The Day of Earwicker's Dream by Nathan Halper, he tries to go about systematically ascertaining what day, or what night, rather, Finnegans Wake takes place on, and he comes to the conclusion that it takes place on the night of Saturday, March 18th, 1922. Hence, the morning in which he awakes would be Sunday morning. And of course, that has a lot of symbolic significance, right? That he wakes up with the sun, very similar to when Zarathustra wakes up to the sun in the beginning of Nietzsche's Also sprach Zarathustra, and he wakes up and he says, "Oh, you beautiful star, who would I be, or who would you be, if you had not those for whom you shine?" Hence, there is a sense of liberation that goes along with Sunday, with rising with nature itself. But of course, the push and pull, which is the one that is crossed out and not Sunday, it seems that that may have been more important, is the ambiguity or the tenuousness of liberatory gestures. And in fact, leaving out Sunday may have meant that he didn't want to be so explicit about the day of rising. He was more concerned about with living in the night comfortably, not really worrying so much about waking, but being comfortable with ambiguities, contingencies, and contradictions inherent to our consciousness. Very interestingly, he speaks of relectic eyes, which seems to have bred within it both electric and the prefix re, as in again. So there's a sense of repetition with visuality, right? There's a sense of continuity in space of what has happened before and after, and there's a sense of extension of inhabiting a space at one location. Hence, eyes, of course, take in information and turn it into electrical impulses, which repeat in continuous fashion and send signals to the brain, which get interpreted. Hence, the focus on visuality as one component half of storytelling, the other half being, of course, sound and the aural. And on the same subject of electricity, he speaks of imprint voltage. This is very interesting, right? Because it's as if when we receive visual or auditory information, the electrical impulses actually imprint into our brains and create an artifact, which is a buildup of neurons whose connections get strengthened over time and build into larger and more dense and strong compacts and milieus and webs, which therefore create a physical artifact of electricity, of the spark of electricity. He speaks of his 2-volt Hertz. Now, of course, we have a binary going here, both on the level of his versus hers and the 2 in 2 volts, but key for our purpose here, of course, is just the 2 volts, the fact that he's again using references to electricity. And there's a lot of references to electric media like radios and TV in Finnegans Wake. And TV was actually in its infancy, so it's quite interesting that we see so much reference to that. But it seems to show Joyce's proclivity for experimenting with different mediums and media. Now, as opposed to the visual, we have the aural, or the in-ear. This also could say im-ear, as in the German im, but the difference is rather moot, at least for our purposes here. And of course, he crossed out aural, and we see references to auricular in Finnegans Wake. That is a word that is actually used. So Joyce is very keen on the importance of the aural to the way that we understand Finnegans Wake, because sound is always present. Even when the dreamer is sleeping, if his eyes are closed, his ears are always open, always receptive to the environment in a way in which they have some sort of connection. And another sort of connection that kind of permeates the wake in a sort of salacious way is a stump. Now, this stump could mean a lot of things, but this seems to be a sort of mythological association between a tree stump and a very small penis. Perhaps just a flaccid penis, which is like a tree stump, and it is standing like a mound on HCE, who is sleeping in the supine position. I think this is a rather charitably self-reflexive passage. I think you'll agree. I know what I want to say, but my deluge is not fun. That's kind of what Finnegans Wake is, right? He kind of knows when he wants to say. He has some semblance of signification, but signification is always slipping in the Derridian sense. It is always deferred, its object elided down in history, and as such, it's like a verbal deluge constantly trying to catch up to itself, to try to get in front of itself and pull itself back into some center. But of course, there's so much creativity in Finnegans Wake that I think it's fair to say that this core is no longer identifiable. It has been so expanded over a landscape, over a sort of plane of immanence, as Deleuze and Guattari would put it, that now all we're left with is the challenger, as he puts it. We've got a very interesting 3-word chain here in which he's experimenting with some D words. First, he has dream. This is dream spelled with an N. I do not know meaningfully what the change in the N could mean, but maybe you do. Another interesting one is dowry. And this reflects the attention Joyce has to females as part of an economy. That historically, women have been the property of either their fathers or their husbands, and the dowry is a way by which they are purchased by their husbands from their fathers, and thereby women are part of a patriarchal economy of exchange. Lastly, we have Dublin. This is Dublin, but it is a sort of dull city, right? Joyce is obsessed with painting Dublin in a very dark, very grimy light, and it is filled with brine, or brine, I think is really what he's trying to say. He just didn't put the E in there because he wanted to obscure it a little bit, so it still looks like Dublin, but right, this is a dull city filled with the brine and the scum of the earth. And in the River Liffey, we find the gum girl, because the Liffey is sticking together like gum because it is filled with fecal matter, because the River Liffey just became a sewage system for Dublin. I think this is a profoundly Nietzschean phrase here, Todleben. This is German for death life or death living. And I think there's something very interesting going on here in which, as Nietzsche would say, one's goings under, one's Untergehen, provide the means by which one can act. It is not by transcending that one finds a grounding in identity, surety, will, or action, but rather it is through the acceptance of one's contingency, one's mortality, and being earthbound. And I think that's what we see in this very short, but in my opinion, very powerful phrase. And when one rises from the dark of sleep and feels the need to urinate, one will often find oneself succumbing to tip nach aim. That being the lack of aim stemming from the tip of the penis when one tries to urinate when one is tired. I think this is a very funny phrase, and he seems to have used it in some manner in Finnegans Wake. I'm not exactly sure how, but it's in there somewhere. Now we get some interesting commentary on ALP here. At the very top, we get a sort of faded image of ALP's sigla, the triangle, and below that the word mer, being French for sea, which of course is an emblematic referent of ALP's, that she's the water, she's the sea. And below that we get the sigla of her daughter, Izzy, this little sideways shape. And it has Izzy, and it says breath gas back for violet sagen. Sagen being German for to say, and this violet may be a reference to Violor d'Amores at the beginning on the first page, which is a reference to the viola d'amore, the instrument, but also the color violet. And now the number 4 has a lot of importance in Finnegans Wake, but I don't exactly know how to gloss this passage aside from Izzy Breathgas. Because since Izzy is sort of the young, volatile spirit of the water, she very, very well may be the sort of gaseous, awful mucus of the River Liffey, which is filled with fecal matter and urine. One of the mythologies of interest in Finnegans Wake is the fall in the Garden of Eden, which of course was started by the serpent in the garden, hence the reference to pythons. Also below that we have a reference to either Earholm, or I can't tell at the end if that is a faded S, in which case it would be Earholms. Now this could be a reference to Homer, and the sort of auditory capacity in which Homer was often recited. Hence, in a way, this may be an exhortation that one should recite Earwicker's story, that being Finnegans Wake. It could be a reference of the fact that as the father figure, HCE, Humphrey Chimpton Earwicker, represents a homely site, an abode which struts out above the earth and stands tall amidst the landscape. Could mean a number of different things. I imagine you could make many more glosses of this word. This is an interesting phrase, tea drinking, ear driving. Now this seems to me to be a symbolization of the physicality of hearing, that hearing drives us forth. For example, when we hear a sound in the wood, it drives our bodies to go into that panic mode in which we search around frantically or run or try to fight or stand still petrified. And this is paired with drinking tea. And tea has significance in Finnegans Wake because the letter, which we see iterated in various forms throughout Finnegans Wake, has a tea stain on it, which is a sort of characteristic mark or blot, which to me seems to be a sort of emblem or artifact for the mark left behind by the author, by the actual individuality of the author, which is not necessarily positive, because of course a stain could be seen as something bad, but ALP oftentimes tries to make light of the tea stain, turn it into something unique, a reason why she loves her husband, HCE. Hence, there's something liberatory about this phrase, while at the same time ambiguous. And Finnegans Wake is concerned with the everyman. Hence, HCE is often called Here Comes Everybody. And one of the important characters in Finnegans Wake is Tim Finnegan, who in the popular Irish ballad falls from a ladder, cracks his skull, and is presumed dead. And they have a wake for him, all of his friends do, and they spill some alcohol on him, which makes him resurrect. And he basically says, well, what, did you think I was dead? Just keep doing what you were doing. And this is reflected in our main character, HCE, the sort of fallen father figure experiencing and dealing with his impotence, and likely the main, if sole character of Finnegans Wake. That is a very debatable phrase, and I'm not, of course, wedded to that. But here we get an important phrase which includes HCE's siglum. A HCE, a full of zerimort. Now, this last word is very interesting. Mort in French is word, and this zeri could be a reference to the German sehr, hence this is very word or very wordly. So HCE is full of very words. This could be like emphatic words, words that do more than they say or mean more than they seem to say. And also we have a reference to the Finnegan, the main character, right? This could be Finn McCool, the famous Irish giant. This could be Tim Finnegan. This could, in fact, be, and this was rather funny, as I had finished my second reading of The Wake, I was lying in bed, and I was rather distraught because it is a sort of rite of passage of Finnegans Wake scholars or enthusiasts that one can find one's name in Finnegans Wake, and I failed in that regard. And yet, as I awoke from my sleep, I remembered that my middle name is Finley. As such, my middle name bears a marked resemblance to literally the main character of Finnegans Wake. So that's pretty funny that I can be so engorged in the zerimort of this text, of the very words of this text, that I forget my own self-identity. On the same subject, Joyce writes orange HCE. This, no doubt, a reference to the Orange British loyalists who were Irish and insisted that Ireland was British, and they were opposed to the Greens, the Irish Republicans, who wanted Ireland to be a free state. They wanted home rule and whatnot, and hence HCE is probably, as many scholars have pointed out, a Protestant, because it is a famed distinction in Ireland that the North is primarily Protestant and the Republic of Ireland is primarily Catholic, and the Protestants tended to be on the side of the British, the Catholics tending to be on the side of the Irish Republic. Now, this could also be a reference to the fact that in Ulysses, Leopold Bloom, who is a Jew living in Ireland, Bloom wants to buy a orange grove in Palestine because he wants to have land in Palestine and hence have a home. So this orange HCE seems really to be filled with the ambiguities and contradictions of the expat Joyce, who feels affinities to the English world and the Irish world and is in between a lot of kind of readjustments that's going on in Irish politics. Hence, this next phrase seems to have a lot of significance. O rex us got of as J bull. Now, that might sound like complete gibberish, but let's break it apart. O rex is Latin for king, so this is O king. Us got of as J bull. Now, J could in fact be Joyce. Joyce the bull, who is the sort of bull in the china shop here. Joyce wants to be the king of the text, and maybe he is somehow apprehended through the text, is the sort of thing that we're trying to get here. Below this, kind of on the same masculinist lines, we have Karl's war, Thor, its father. Now, I don't know what Karl's war, I don't know who Karl is, but of course we have Thor here, who is the god of thunder, and the thunder words are very prevalent throughout Finnegans Wake. We have one on the first page, right after the fall, and this is the sort of voice of the Divine Father, God, who in Vico's New Science starts history by striking fear into man, causing us to build family kinship ties and hence very basic society. And hence we have the simultaneity of history, society, and war, and hence also patriarchy that goes along with deciding who runs the family, that being the father in this case, all kind of tied up into this short phrase. And it's interesting that considering that sort of imperialistic, paternalistic connotation of HCE's character, that Joyce later writes ALP, land grabber. Now, it would seem much more intuitive for Joyce to write HCE, land grabber. Hence, he would be associated with Napoleon or the Duke of Wellington or King Henry VIII or something, right? Some of these famous warlords of various kinds who are trying to secure land. In the case of the Duke of Wellington, right, this would be securing home rules, hence the home that represents HCE's sense of security. But I think here this might have a slightly sexual connotation, considering that HCE's body is often equated with or metamorphosed into the physical landscape. Hence, the first page famously kind of charts a map of HCE's body, with his head being up at Howth and his penis being the Wellington Monument down in Phoenix Park. Hence, land grabber may have a sort of sexual connotation of like groping HCE. And the female characters in Finnegans Wake are always a bit salacious. They are supporters and kind of more traditionally maternal, but they're also very lively and exciting and willing to help and be active in a very chaotic way, right? Because the female characters often represent water with all of its ebbing and flowing. Hence, ALP, sleeping giant, Dead's niter host bright. This is a very convoluted phrase. Obviously, the sort of syntax is breaking down a little bit, but ALP seems to be next to the sleeping giant on the bed, who appears to be dead, or in fact, it may say deadly. So our deadly niter host may be HCE, who sort of threatens the family with his volatility, which often happens because in real life, HCE is probably Mr. Porter, who is a pub keeper in Chapelizod in Dublin, and he drinks the spare drinks when his customers have left the bar once it's closed, and he often gets very topsy-turvy because of this, and hence it's very likely that maybe he does get volatile, hence our deadly niter host. And bright may symbolize a sort of divine spark in him, that despite him being deadly and dangerous, he is nevertheless a sort of bright host, right? Like the host that you get in communion. This is a quite insightful phrase for understanding HCE's sexual impotence. Wood pump of the softwood weeping. This seems very plainly to be referring to a flaccid penis, right? A wood, which is in fact a soft wood, and therefore weeping. Hence, maybe it is dripping ejaculate of some kind. I don't know. Also here we have high-low laws, which is a sort of contradiction in terms in and of itself, right? That laws are trying to bridge the gap between the immanent and the transcendent, between the subjective and the objective, between something particular and something universal, and hence the tenuous nature of law in Finnegans Wake. That guilt, for example, as a legal category is all but abandon because we can't even get a solid sense of character and things like that. Now, this passage got me really excited when I saw it because I've done a video on this passage before where he talks about the abnihilization of the Edom, which has often been interpreted as talking about the splitting of the atom in the atom bomb. And here he writes the split atom and crosses it out, which is a good indication that he was actually taking this part and splicing it into that abnihilization of the atom. But of course, here he's playing with the word slightly differently. It's atom, thus very similar to Adam the particle and Adam the man. This is one of his more dizzyingly scribbled pages, but we can make out wind of moideloid missoil. And I can't read any more than that. But wind of moideloid. This might be my delusion, but also this OID suffix. I think about like schizoid, right? This is some sort of mental complication of some kind, some delusion, which is my soil. But this could also be like Miss Royal, as in I am not measuring up to royalty. I have in some way failed to measure up to the promise of the past, of history, of the precedent of my lineage. Now, this is one of the more legible and yet nevertheless obscure passages. Lower Bashna fall to Potter, Lugatwing, Molnia, Island, Osor Rainbow. I can't read this part. To shoot Shellier Gew Rice. What does that mean? I have no idea. I can see lower fall, hence this might be, of course, a reference to the fall. Potter, as in Potter for father. Lugatwing, this might be a reference to Lichtung, the German for clearing. I see island in here, but also mixed with the word Lao, and of course we have rainbow in there, and then shoot some kind of gooey rice or something like that. I really have no idea what's going on here, but perhaps the most important part of this page is at the very end. Book garbly. Right, this is garbled garbage, which is Finnegans Wake. That being said, that concludes this very long and meandering discussion of the Finnegans Wake notebook number 37. Hopefully this helps you have a deeper appreciation for Joyce's very in-depth developmental creative process and the revisions that it underwent and the way that his intentions developed over time, through time, and in time. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because anything that is given is much appreciated, but no worries. Take care of yourself. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.